The silence sentence. The strange part of this punishment is that silence was the whole point. In 13th century England, if you were charged with a felony and refused to speak a plea, the court legally could not move forward. Judges found a way around it. They laid the accused naked on the floor, tied each arm and leg to a corner of the room, then placed iron and stone on the chest, a little more added each day, until a word finally came out. Here is what most people miss. Staying silent was never stubbornness. It was strategy. If you pleaded and were convicted, the Crown seized everything you owned, leaving your family with nothing. If you never pleaded at all, the law said you could not technically be convicted, so your land still passed to your children even as you were dying under the weight. A punishment designed to force speech became a way to buy your family's future with your own ribs. In 1586, Margaret Clitheroe was crushed under more than 700 pounds and died within 15 minutes, refusing to plead in order to protect her children from being forced to testify. In 1692, during the Salem witch trials, Giles Corey refused to plead and was pressed to death over 2 full days. Witnesses claim his last words were simply, "More weight." England did not ban the practice until 1772. The last recorded case happened in 1741, nearly 500 years after it began as a bureaucratic loophole. Boiling to death, the Cook's Law. This was not a standing punishment on the books. It was written into law for one specific man. In February 1531, a cook named Richard Roos put poison into porridge served at the home of the Bishop of Rochester in London. 2 people who ate it died. Henry VIII, already paranoid about being poisoned himself, pushed a new statute through Parliament within weeks, making death by poisoning an act of treason, punishable by boiling alive, a method that did not exist as English law before this case. Rose was chained to a pulley and lowered into a cauldron of boiling water 3 separate times over roughly 2 hours at Smithfield in April 1532. A witness at the time wrote that he roared so loudly that pregnant women in the crowd had to be carried away half dead. The method was chosen on purpose to mirror his crime, cooking the poisoner the same slow way he had cooked his poison. The law was repealed just 15 years later in 1547, and boiling to death was used only one more time in all of English history, on a maidservant named Margaret Davy in 1542. Tarring and feathering. The thief's mark. This did not begin as torture at all. In 1189, King Richard the Lionheart issued a naval ordinance stating that any sailor caught stealing at sea would have his head shaved, hot pitch poured over it, feathers shaken on top, and then be dropped off at the first port the ship reached, marked publicly so everyone would know what he had done. It was built purely as identification. Nobody designed it to maim. Centuries later, mobs took the same idea and stripped out the mercy. Tar was poured straight onto bare skin, sometimes still hot enough to blister, then feathers were pressed into it by hand. Pulling the tar off later tore away skin and hair with it. In 1774, a Boston customs official named John Malcolm was tarred and feathered twice in 1 year, and the second time left the skin on his knees, stripped raw to the bone. A punishment invented to mark a thief at sea became, 600 years later, a weapon mobs used to destroy a person's body in broad daylight. Keelhauling, the barnacle. Cut sailors were already being dragged under ships through an older punishment called ducking. What made it lethal was never part of anyone's plan. Wooden hulls left sitting in seawater for months grew thick beds of barnacles, and those barnacles were sharp as broken glass. When a sailor was tied to a rope, weighted down at the ankles, and pulled under the keel from one side of the ship to the other, it was the barnacles doing the cutting, not the crew. Crews eventually learned to exploit this by accident. If a ship had just been cleaned and the hull ran too smooth, they hauled the sailor bow to stern instead, the full length of the vessel, just to make the ordeal last longer. In 1652, a Dutch sailor named Jan Blank became one of the earliest fully recorded cases, and a painting from that decade still shows a ship's surgeon being keel-hauled in front of a watching crew. The Dutch Navy did not officially end the practice until the 1750s. Ducking stool, the scold's chair. This one was built purely to embarrass, nothing more. A woman labeled a scold, usually for arguing loudly with her husband or gossiping about her neighbors, was strapped into a wooden chair on the end of a long beam and lowered into a pond or river in front of a watching crowd. The goal was public shame. Death was never supposed to be part of it, but cold water and repeated shock killed people who had only been sentenced to humiliation. Records describe women fainting mid-dunking or drowning outright after too many rounds in freezing water. In a separate but related practice, if a woman accused of witchcraft happened to drown during a water test, she was declared innocent after the fact, a small and useless mercy for someone who was already dead. Ducking stools were still in active use in England as late as 1808. Iron Maiden, the lie that became history. This one never existed in the Middle Ages at all. In 1793, a philosopher named Johann Siebenkees published an account describing a counterfeiter supposedly executed in the year 1515 inside a spiked iron coffin. No record of any such device exists from before the 18th century. He simply invented the story out of nothing. The story took on a life of its own almost immediately. Collectors in the 1800s built actual spiked cabinets out of old scrap metal and displayed them in museums as genuine medieval torture devices, charging paying visitors to walk through and see them up close. The most famous version, the Iron Maiden of Nuremberg, was built in the early 1800s and destroyed decades later in an Allied bombing raid in 1944. A single invented story turned into a physical object, and that object turned into a fact millions of people still repeat today, describing a punishment that never actually killed anyone, because it was never real. Guillotine, the mercy machine. In 1789, Dr. Joseph Guillotin stood before the French National Assembly, arguing against pain, not for it. At the time, nobles were beheaded quickly with a sword, while ordinary commoners were hanged slowly, sometimes choking at the end of a rope for several minutes. Guillotin wanted one fast, equal method of death that applied to everyone, no matter their social class. The machine built by surgeon Antoine Louis and a harpsichord maker delivered exactly what Guillotin had asked for, an angled blade that dropped and finished in under a second. Within a single year, that same machine became the primary engine of the Reign of Terror. Between 1793 and 1794 alone, close to 17,000 people were executed by it. And the executioner Charles Sanson once beheaded 300 people across 3 consecutive days. Robespierre, the man who once called it the instrument of virtue, was executed by his own invention in 1794. A tool designed specifically to end suffering became the fastest killing machine of its century, and it remained in official use in France until 1977. Wooden horse, the discipline seat. This one began as a mild military punishment, nothing close to what it became. Armies used it for small offenses, drunkenness, tardiness, talking back to an officer. A soldier straddled a narrow wooden beam shaped like a saddle, sat there for 15 minutes to an hour, and walked away sore. That was the entire design. Officers then added a detail meant only to keep the soldier from sliding off. Weights tied to the ankles. The extra pull dragged the body down onto the sharp edge of the beam instead of holding it steady, tearing into the groin and spine. What started as a stabilizer became the actual source of the damage. In 1646, French Jesuit records describe a man mounting the device for gluttony and becoming, in their own word, ruptured. In 1775, George Washington approved 15 minutes on it for a soldier who had threatened fellow prisoners with a loaded musket. Union Guards later built a 15-foot version nicknamed Morgan's Mule and rode Confederate prisoners on it for hours at a time until they collapsed. A punishment meant to leave soldiers only sore by morning ended up leaving some of them permanently unable to walk,